Hello, my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about the books that I read in the first half of July because unexpectedly July was quite a big reading month for me. So looking at the first half of July, I want to start off by examining the statistics for the month so far. I have read 9 books, and across those 9 books, the format that I have read them in, 2 of them were physical books, 7 were audiobooks, although one of those audiobooks was technically also a hybrid because I did read parts of the ebook. So the numbers in this statistic are a little wonky because I did technically read across all formats this month. Now let's look at where I got all of these books from. 3 of the books that I read were ARCs, 4 of them were books that I borrowed from the library, and 2 of them were owned books. Now on to the authors that I read from this month. Of the 9 books that I read, 1 was by an Asian author, 3 were by white authors, 2 by Black authors, 2 by Swana authors, and 1 by a Pacific Islander author. The countries that I read from this month were honestly pretty limited. Most of them were the United States. I think 1 was Canada, and then 1 was from Sudan, and 1 was from Spain. I'm not going to talk about my average rating because I am going to wait and share that in the end of the month wrap up because I just wait and count at the end of the month. But those are all the statistics that I have so far for my reading in July. Finally, let's talk about the books that I read from. The first one that I read was Night Owl. This is by one of my favorite poets, Aimee Nezhukumatathil. A 5-star read for me, to be quite honest. It was one of my favorite books of the month so far. I really love Aimee's writing style. She has such a way of writing about nature and animals that is just really endearing. This collection is similar to many of her previous collections in that it is examining animals and the world around us. This collection is specifically looking at night owls, so animals that thrive during the nighttime. Even beyond that, it's much more personal, where she kind of confronts the various things that we believe about the nighttime and our behaviors at night, the things that maybe we are scared to talk about, the things that we find comfort in during these times. I think what always stands out to me with her poetry is the way that she explores concepts in her poems through animals, but connecting them back to humans, not in a way to make them behave like humans, but showing this kind of commonality between humans and nature, this connection between different events that I think works really well with her poetry style. There were also some more experimental poems in this that were shaped like some of the animals that she was talking about, which I really enjoyed. I just love this poet, and her collections have been something that I really enjoyed reading through. I was really excited to have enjoyed this one as much as I did. The next book is a book that everyone is talking about right now, and I was lucky enough that my library hold finally came through much earlier than I expected, and that is Yesteryear by Caro Claire Burke. This is a book that has a lot of people very divided, and I have really been shocked at seeing how a lot of people are talking about this book, because a lot of people view this as a book that is directly making fun of tradwives, or that it is really like this mocking commentary. And I don't quite believe that that was actually the author's intent here. For anyone who is unaware of what this book is about, it is about a woman who is a tradwife influencer and is sent back in time to this time period that is kind of reminiscent of the things that she is promoting online. The story is actually pretty interesting in this because for most of the first half of the book, we actually are focused on her backstory. There is the initial jump back in time, but then we go back to her personal history. And I think the way that that was incorporated into the story was actually really well done. There is a very clear through line in this for me of how this character came to be the way that she is, why she embodies these ideals, and why she is incredibly hypocritical of many of the people that she encounters. Something about this book really reminded me of a part of my own upbringing in terms of growing up in a small Midwestern town and then going to school at a rather larger Midwestern university where there were a lot of people with ideals like this person, not necessarily to the extent of her, but there are certainly some people that do share the same values as this character. And I do find that the kind of hypocrisy that this character espouses is incredibly similar to that. I think there is a point that the author is trying to make about how unhappiness within creates unhappiness outside. I found this character to be a compelling way to explore that because I do think there's something that a lot of people misunderstand when there are these public figures who have benefited from the very things that they're criticizing, and yet people just call them hypocrites. They don't look at the kind of reasoning behind it, the kind of power that lies in convincing people that they deserve to be in a specific place in life, in a specific family dynamic. And that is natural. That is what your religion, maybe your family upbringing wants you to have. And that is the only acceptable role for you. There's a power in that. I think it's definitely showing an extreme in some of the things, especially when we're in the head of the main character and the way that she views people. people. But I also think that that is incredibly realistic to people, and that some people who read this book thought that it was mocking them and were disgruntled with that. That is a point of self-reflection. But I think that there were also people who read this who thought that she was just dragging and dogging on these people. And I don't really think that that's what the author was trying to do either. I think she was trying to show someone who was really hard to like and why she's hard to like. I think the author was trying to show us that these people exist and they are so incredibly good at presenting themselves in a certain way to the public so that the public does not realize how they actually feel. Or even in their own lives, their own family dynamics might be something that they're hiding from other family members, from their friends. They may not have friends, and that also contributes to this kind of personality that is crafted in this story. Yeah, unfortunately, I think that this book was a little too on the nose for me. There are still parts of it that I did not find perfect or flawless in its storytelling or in maybe the crafting of the arc that this story takes. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars, but I do definitely think that there is something really interesting that this author was trying to say. After that one, I decided to go really into the past and read a classic fiction book, and this was Season of Migration to the North. This is by Tayeb, who is a pretty famous Sudanese author, and this was translated from the Arabic by Johnson-Davies. This is a book that is really hard to talk about because in some ways I really loved this book, and in other ways I really was frustrated by it. This book is definitely a product of its time in both good and bad ways. And what I mean by that is that this offers such an interesting glance into life in Sudan right after it gained its independence and what this kind of meant for the country as it was reforming. So we follow a man who is educated abroad and is coming back to his village in Sudan, where he meets a man who starts to intrigue him because he believes that he is living this kind of double life or has lived this double life. So he tries to get close to this man to learn more about him. The man's story unfolds in terms of the revelations that are given to our main character, but it's also a story of so many things beyond the story of this one man, or even the story of our narrator, who is also eventually the semi-focal point of the story and whose story kind of continues on with its own narrative here. But as I said, it's about so much more than that. This is really a lot about this life in Sudan at a time where the country was rapidly changing in many ways, especially in the capital, but also really sticking to traditions in other ways and remaining unchanged in these smaller villages. It's showing that kind of dichotomy between these experiences abroad, then these experiences in the village where things operate in a very different way. I think this was a pretty jarring commentary on the legacies of colonialism, fetishization of people from formerly colonized places, and westernization in formerly colonized places in their independence eras, and what that actually looked like in practice for some versus many. A lot of this book reminded me of the Robert Frost poem about two paths diverging in the woods. I don't think that's the exact quote, but I'm hoping you'll understand which poem I'm referring to, because this really does explore two very different experiences in two different generations with this post-colonial legacy. However, I will say the story itself as a narrative is really jumpy. It's told in a traditional nested story way for, I think, like the first part of the book. And then if I remember correctly, the second half was these like short chunks of story that you're being told, and you know that time has passed, but you are kind of filling in the blanks of what has happened. There are some really funny lines in this, I think, that I didn't really expect, especially for the time period, regarding certain things that I think in the West we would assume would be taboo in these communities, or would be taboo for just the timing that these events were happening, because I believe this book was written in the 1950s or 60s. As I said, a product of its time. There's a lot of sexualization of women. There is a kind of normalized violence against women, and I think that in some ways it is convincing enough to tie into this bigger conversation that the book is having about this kind of conceptualization of the world post-colonialism. But I also just didn't enjoy reading about some of those things, and that made this a really hard read for me at times. I landed about 3 stars for this one because of the kind of issues that I had with the storytelling techniques in this book and some of the descriptions of things that I just didn't really think were necessary or added anything to the story, but were more for shock value. But I'm glad to have read it because I've been wanting to read more classics from non-Western countries, and this certainly did enlighten me on a different perspective. Next up was another translated work. This one was a poetry collection called One Moment by Muñoz. This was translated from the Spanish by Garth Greenwell and Idra Novey, a poetry collection that I received as an ARC. This is a bilingual collection, so one side of the collection is obviously in English and the other is in the original Spanish. I was reading the English half of the book, and this was a very weird collection. I can definitely see the attempts here because this is a compilation of moments from everyday life. It truly does feel like one moment in a poem. However, that was not so successful in certain parts of this collection. My biggest problem was actually the first part of this collection, because the poems were so short that I really couldn't understand or grasp what exactly was going on in these poems, what the point was to them, if there was a through line or a connection between them. It was just confusing. The second part was a little bit better. These poems felt a little bit more cohesive. They were tied together by this string of like letters that you were being left with, which I was then kind of confused about by the end of that section, because I assumed it would spell a word or something. If it did, I could not figure it out. So maybe I just didn't get it. The final section was okay. I think there was some merit to some of the poems there, but as a collection overall, I just did not feel like this was cohesive. I felt like the writing was really disjointed. I don't think that the poetry style was really for me. And stylistically, I just found it to be really lackluster. If it hadn't been so short, I probably honestly wouldn't have finished this, because I just really did not get on with the poetry style. I ended up giving it 1.5 stars. After that, I needed something that I knew I was going to enjoy. So I picked up the second book in the Green Sisters trilogy by Kristina Forrest. This is The Partner Plot. This follows the second sister, Violet, who was kind of all over the place in the first book, and I think that this book really helped me in feeling like I better understood her and like she was more grounded. In book 1, she is described as the sister who is a fashion stylist for celebrities. She is jet setting all over the world, and she really doesn't have time for any type of social life, whether that be romantic or friendship. She is just all over the place. I really liked the setup to this book, and I don't want to say too much about it because I don't want there to be any spoilers for book 1 or also like events obviously in this book. But I think the setup for this worked actually much better than I thought it would. And I really loved both of the main characters that we got here. And I felt like I could relate to both of them in various different ways in terms of the period of life that I was in, certain events that had happened recently. I really love Kristina Forrest's characters, and this really solidified for me that I think her characters are the best part of her books. The romance elements are really well done in both the first book and this book, but her characters are ones that just really stick with you, and I'm so glad that I got to return to them here. I loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. I think in some ways I did love it a little bit more than the first one even. So I'm now really excited for the last book, following the oldest sister, Iris, because I have just been eating this series up and I am so happy to be continuing on with it. After my successes in the beginning of the month with Night Owl and then Kristina Forrest's book, I thought I had found my favorites for the month. I never imagined that another book that I would pick up would really rival those for my favorite of the month, especially not a short story collection. And that collection is Extinction, Capital of the World by Mariah Rigg. Mariah Rigg is a Samoan Haole author who grew up in Hawaii. And this collection is completely focused on life in Hawaii. The stories are focused on the history of colonization in Hawaii and the legacies of that in the modern day, but it's also focused on all of these different characters. Some of the stories are interconnected to each other, which might be hard to keep track of if you are, dipping in and out of this one, because there's quite a lot of characters in this collection and there are little ways that some of them intersect with one another. I don't mean that to discourage anyone from this, because I think that this is still a very manageable collection in terms of remembering the people, the places. This really embodied what I love about short story collections, which is when they can make characters feel so incredibly vibrant and alive in such a short amount of time. For me personally, that's one of the hardest things that I see in short stories, is that the characters feel very confined to the story. And in this collection, they did not. They felt like they really leapt off the pages. I could understand and conceptualize that these characters interacted with each other or lived near each other because they felt that realistic to me. As I said, a lot of this is about the legacies of colonization in Hawaii and present day struggles with people. But there's also a lot of cultural context that is embedded into these stories that I think was pretty accessible for a reader who does not come from this background and has very limited information on this background. I think that it is contextualized in the story in a way where I never felt like I was confused about something or didn't know something, but it's also not just plainly explained to you what all of these terms or these things mean, which I appreciate that hard work being shifted to the reader in terms of understanding the context rather than it being spelled out in a story where that wouldn't feel natural or make sense. I had a lot of favorites in this collection. I will say that I listened to this one on audiobook because I had a very long overdue arc of the audiobook that I finally just wanted to pick up because I was in the mood for short stories. The narration was amazing, especially in terms of understanding like certain place names or character names. But beyond that, it was also nice in distinguishing between the stories because I did feel like there was a distinct voice in them. I definitely want to pick up a physical copy of this collection soon because I can see myself rereading this, especially with the amount of favorite stories that I had in this. Truly everything felt so intentional in this collection. Every word was so specifically used. All the characters were so vibrant and dynamic. It was truly just an amazing collection. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. After that, I oddly transitioned to middle grade for the last little bit of the first half of July. I don't know why I was really in the mood for it. I had a few books that were available through Libby or that I had on my own device that I was like, why not just pick it up? The first one I started with was The Burning Season. This was by Carolyn Starr Rose. I had such high hopes for this because it is the story of this young girl who is living in a forest, and her family for generations have been watchers for wildfires in forests. And they're kind of raising her in the watchtower to learn about this profession and the need for protecting the environment and their home. I will say it was a little bit confusing in the first part of the book because I definitely thought this was a little bit sci-fi with how things were being described. It was a little odd. I also want to say that this is a book that was told in verse, and that might not be everybody's jam. I have to be honest that I think it was really mixed in its use here. I don't think that it really added that much to the story. I do think there were parts where there needed to be much more explanation of things. This was also something that led, I think, to my initial misunderstanding that there might be sci-fi elements to this because of the way that certain things are so briefly talked about and described. I felt like we were almost intentionally being kept away from information. That is more just to do with the storytelling component. This just really missed the mark for me in terms of the adults in this were making terrible decisions, and then the child was being burdened with a lot of those decisions. And while that is realistic, certainly, like that happens in life all the time, in the book, these decisions were so incredibly contrived. They don't feel natural. They feel very bizarre, especially with how we're first kind of introduced to the characters. It didn't feel like there was a cohesive characterization of them throughout the book. There's especially one scene that I don't want to talk about because I don't want to give a spoiler for something that happens in the book. But the way this adult responds to the situation and blames the child really bothered me because I just could not conceptualize how the adult in the situation did not recognize that it was another adult's fault that this situation happened. Yeah, I don't know. I just think it's really difficult because, like, on the one hand, the author's note in the ending of the book, you can tell this author is really passionate about this. And you can tell also that she was very passionate about making sure that the indigenous community that traditionally protected these lands was recognized, that their traditional practices were also incorporated into the story and discussed and acknowledged because of how their removal from this land deeply affected the environment there. And also that removal and that refusal to believe indigenous leaders in the practices that they had been doing for generations, that led to a lot of these forest fires. I did appreciate that aspect to this, and I think that the author's love and commitment to this kind of history, this kind of knowledge, was very clear in the story itself. But I don't think that the actual story of this character and her family was well done, which actually made this a pretty disappointing read for me. I landed at 2.5 out of 5 stars for this, just because I really could not get over many of the bigger issues that I had here. The next middle grade that I picked up was From the Desk of Zoe Washington by Janae Marks. This is the first in a series. We follow a young girl named Zoe who turns into an investigative journalist of sorts when she receives a letter from her biological father explaining that he is in prison, but he was wrongfully convicted. She was raised with a mother and a stepfather who love her very much, but have really kept her away from her father or knowing anything about him. So she sets out on this journey to kind of discover what happened. Simultaneously, she is really passionate about baking and is doing a summer internship at a bakery to convince her parents that she should try out for this baking kids TV show. That is the setup to the story. Now let's talk about the actual execution of it. First, I want to say that I got really confused by this because I misread something on the synopsis and I thought she was solving a case of someone completely unrelated to her. I had no idea that it was her father. I think that choice in this actually made the story more impactful because we learn a lot through Zoe's eyes and see the emotional toll that it has on her through these experiences that she learns about of racial profiling and policing, wrongful convictions, and the ways in which the justice system has flaws that she was previously unaware of. I really think that that messaging through this book was incredibly important and incredibly well done. I loved Zoe as a main character. I think that she was a very courageous girl who also felt very realistic of a child in terms of the types of adults she reaches out to for support, the ways in which she tries to approach things and she considers a lot of things. and her own fears and anxieties. I just loved her as a character. I really do want to continue on with this series because I would love to see more of her. And I'm very curious about this aspect of baking that we see in this book, because baking was a big part for the first half of this book. And I think that you can definitely understand Zoe's love of this. However, I felt like in the second half of the book, this really took a backseat. And then there is this very rushed explanation in the ending for why this was not really a thing anymore that kind of annoyed me in this. I'm hoping maybe it will come back in later books in the series, because I would definitely love to follow along with these characters again. But that left this for me at about 4 out of 5 stars. The last book that I want to talk about is Grounded. This is an odd book. It is a group of authors who wrote this book together. Each of them took a different character though, and so through the chapters of the book you rotate the characters' perspectives, but technically each author was only responsible for their one part. So this was written by 4 authors. Those are Aisha Saeed, Jamilah Thompkins-Bigelow, S.K. Ali, and Huda Al-Marashi. And I'm really glad that they brought this project to life because this was such a fun read. It is the story of these kids who are all stuck at an airport after an Islamic convention. I love these characters. I think that they were a fun group, and there is this mystery aspect to it where they're trying to track down this missing cat in the airport. That was such a fun storyline. I also want to say that for this book to be written by 4 different people, it never felt like that because the writing felt very cohesive, the stories all tied together, the characters even felt very realistic and like they really jumped off the page with their personalities. This mystery and the children themselves are obviously the focal point, but there are definitely important side plots in this that I think were really well done about bigger, harder topics that are more approachable for children in the way that they have been explored here. I just had such a fun time with this. I will say my only hindrance in recommending this is that I cannot recommend the audiobook for this. I listened to the audiobook, and had I not loved the story and the characters and 2 of the narrators in this, I think I really would have DNF'd it because the 2 male narrators put on such weird voices for the kids, especially the one who narrates Feek. That is a man who is middle-aged, and he's doing these weird little raps that are a part of the story, but he's trying to pretend to be a child, and it just did not work out well for me. I think the other male narrator was actually a narrator who I've listened to a lot of things by. I think it was Neil Shaw, and I found his narration style to be insane for the character that he had. The voice that he put on just was not great. So yeah, the male narrators were not great. I would not recommend this as an audiobook. I would definitely recommend it as a physical book because it is a lovely story. That concludes all of the books that I have to talk with you about today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I would love to hear about what you have been reading recently. Thank you for watching and happy reading. Bye!